By now, I'm sure many of you have played or at least heard of Lethal Company. It's a game mostly known for its casual fun, but also manages to balance that with horrifying moments. And it's been one of my new favorite games for a couple of months now. But hidden under the surface, if you take a second to analyze the environment, the enemies, the secret logs, and the information given to you on your computer terminal, you realize that this world is a mere remnant of what once was, and your crew seems to be all that's left. A few months back, I made a video covering the lore that we discovered through the logs Sigurd left behind, which could be accessed via the ship's computer terminal after collection. These logs were more specifically pertaining to his personal experiences regarding the company and actually working for them, but his logs weren't the only thing that were left behind for you to find. The Bestiary entries and the history of every moon is also available from your terminal, and I had previously ignored these other things because I didn't think they were significant, but I realize now that was a mistake. The idea that a war happened in Lethal Company's history is not new, nor is it unique. However, I believe version 50 has added a lot more context that makes this more interesting of a discussion than it was before. And today I'm going to share with you all the Lethal Company war theory. Just in case some of you are out of the loop and haven't seen my previous video, I will go ahead and summarize Sigurd's story that we learn through his logs. His original log can be found by reading the sticky note found inside of your ship. He says that his brother Desmond set up a log system on the computer terminal and that he's writing them to keep himself sane. Apparently, the turnover rate at the company is massive and the logs are meant to be kept as a historical record. This is dated August 22nd, 1968. As the logs continue, we learn about Sigurd's encounters with the company building, how he could hear screams over the walkie-talkie which seemed to come from beyond the massive wall, holding back some kind of great entity. The voices in the wall told of a beast who swallowed a golden planet, which was previously thought to just be a fairy tale. Apparently it was real. Later on, he goes on to realize how shady the company is, how some fake-sounding voice over the phone talked to everyone during their orientation. Sigurd's brother Desmond traces the call from the company back, only to realize the call is coming from across the entire solar system. Sigurd even has a dream of the monster breaking free from the wall. They'd slowly forgotten how they even got there in the first place. And finally, on October 3rd, Desmond writes the final log, not Sigurd. He encrypts the logs to keep them hidden for future crewmates, and it's then that they begin to realize they're just expendable workers hired to keep a giant monster tame by feeding it scrap metal. From here on, there are no more logs left behind from this crew. We can assume that they either all died, or were simply unable to meet their ever-increasing quota. But obviously, this is not the whole story. If we want all of the context, we're also going to need to check out the Bestiary and the Moon information entries. I'm not going to cover each and every one of them because doing so would be a waste of time, especially since most of the information is simply meant to help you play the game more effectively. Instead, I want to focus on the bits and pieces I feel are actually relevant. So first off, we learned from the Bunker Spiders Bestiary entry that these spiders evolved within a measly few centuries to prey on large mammals after, quote, the boat made its trip around the Thistle Nebula. It then tells us to refer back to an article or study titled Speculation on Increased Speciation Around the Fading Nebulae. We also learn of a kill-on-sight order for the Bunker Spiders, which was approved by an organization named the ITDA back in 1965, and that detail will be very important to remember for later. I believe the boat was likely a spacefaring vessel that was responsible for carrying smaller creatures and insects that we might be more familiar with from other planets to these moons in the Thistle Nebula, and from there, they were influenced by this rapid rate of evolution, which resulted in some of the enemies that we're familiar with now. Obviously, there are a few other creatures which could be categorized as supernatural instead, such as the Ghost Girl and the Masked. There's also a newer enemy added in version 50, the Butler, which also seems to be supernatural. Unlike the other two, this creature didn't have a bestiary entry, so Sigurd made one himself. He described being able to clearly hear the buzzing of the hornets inside of them. If you kill a butler, they'll drop a knife, but also pop like a balloon and release a crowd of hornets. Based on its description, I'd say this is a bit too otherworldly to not be defined as supernatural. The rest of the creatures have bestiary entries which don't really offer any interesting details for the wider narrative. There are quite a few clearly man-made entities to be found in Lethal Company as well. From a gameplay perspective, there's certainly tons of fun, but they feel pretty out of place when put alongside the organic creatures. Let's talk about them. The Nutcracker, which seems to be at least partially organic, has no explanation as to its origin within its entry. It's simply referred to as the guardian of the house. The Jesters were similar to the Butlers. They didn't have any record at all before Sigurd came along. Like the Nutcrackers, they also seem partially organic. It's genuinely pretty odd. Where it gets the most interesting, though, is the Coilheads. The Coilheads are described as being recently discovered, but very misunderstood due to being extremely dangerous to analyze. They can combust when being dissected and carry high levels of radiation. They're also known to have a reset mode if a loud noise or bright light happens close enough to them. It's speculated that they were created as biological weapons of war. These details are very important to keep in mind. I'm sure you don't really need me to tell you that, though. It's not even that surprising. I mean, what purpose could this creature possibly serve other than mass annihilation as a war weapon? But it runs deeper than that, much deeper. The Old Bird is a newer enemy, added in version 50. It's a giant killer robot that is virtually indestructible and can kill you and anything around it with ease. And their bestiary entry is ridiculously long, like essay length, and it sheds a lot more light on this world than we've ever had before. It begins by immediately describing it as a weapon of war, not speculation based like the Coilhead, but it's a known fact. It is specifically described as having a headlight capable of emitting 100,000 lumens and a sound cannon affixed to its chest. It also has additional speakers used to broadcast messages, which in-game can either be random unintelligible noises or the sound of a crying baby. It also describes them as being the first extraorbital weapons to be used and mass-produced. Despite so much being known about them, though, their origin is completely unknown. Their first recorded appearance was an invasion on the Anglian capital on December 18th, 2143, which is cited by historians as the first major cause for the downfall of that empire. It is speculated that the tensions between the Anglian and Bumok militaries may have caused this, but it could never be proven even centuries later. They're widely known to never leave the planets that they venture to, despite having more than enough fuel to do so, though there are rumors of them autonomously venturing to new planets. Historically, the Old Birds were given the name AL based on a codename designated by the English military A16L31. The reason why they have the nickname Old Bird now is because of cultural influence from a song that came out in 2384 and an artist's depiction of them using the name of that song 3 years later. The end of the entry describes one of the newer moons that we've yet to visit, 5 Embryon, which was condemned for travel or settlement by the boat in 2356. Eyewitness accounts described Old Birds lining the horizon of that moon. So, if it isn't obvious, there are a wild amount of implications in this entry alone that completely upturn our previous understanding. First things first, this log contains information as recent as 2356, but it was also given a danger level by Sigurd and also has him talking about them at the very end of the bestiary entry. And for obvious reasons, this should not be possible, because all of Sigurd's logs are dated blatantly with the year 1968. The only way that this could be possible is if Sigurd lived for several centuries or some kind of purposeful discrepancy in the dates is present. I have heard a theory in the past that the computer simply displays the log dates incorrectly, but the one wrench in this theory is that the date 1965 is also referenced, and that's not a log, it's just a bit of documented information. All we know for certain is that the timeline of events no longer makes sense given our current information. There's also a reference to one of the new moons, Ambient, and once again, the boat is mentioned. This time the boat almost seems to be referred to as an organization as opposed to just being like a spaceship. It could be both. I'll save further details on Ambient for discussion related to the moons, which I think we're ready to do now, so let's get into it. Based on the brief descriptions we get of the moons, we know that Experimentation and Assurance are twin moons of a gas giant nicknamed Big Grin. However, both of these moons were discovered relatively recently within the wider timescale, at least when it was documented. Unfortunately, we have no idea how reliable any of the moon descriptions are because we have no idea how old the information is. Experimentation was used in secret, which implies that some third party was doing something that they didn't want everyone else to know about. This mirrors the creation of the Old Birds, another project that was seemingly undertaken in secret. Offense is believed to be an asteroid moon that was split off from Assurance, only existing on its own for a few centuries. However, the facilities on it were built far before this splintering from Assurance. Considering Assurance's recent discovery alongside Experimentation, this implies Assurance was probably also being used for some kind of secret objective because it also has a facility on it. Rend and Dine are both relatively uninteresting, being frigid, snow-covered moons orbiting a white dwarf star. Titan, on the other hand, we know for a fact was once inhabited by at least some people. We learn from one of Sigurd's logs that there was talk of a war starting soon between people on Titan around the time they were working for the company. It's not going to look the same in 2 years. Vow, March, and Adamance, which is one of the new moons, are all part of a trio of moons referred to as the Green Witches. They all orbit a planet named No Service. Vow is referred to as previously being colonized, and although it is not explicitly stated for March and Adamance, we can probably assume that they're equally habitable. Adamance in particular has a small cabin left behind, which requires a key in order to be accessed. Once you do access it, you see on the wall, spray painted by someone who came before you, 68 art. Upon typing this into the terminal, you're greeted by the moon Artifice, with a hefty 1,500 credit price tag to get there. Artifice is described as having a landscape littered with abandoned facilities, once teeming with life. Weapons and classified technology were left behind, dating back at least when the information was cataloged, 200 years. If this was referring to the year in which old birds were first observed, the documentation of Artifice would have been vaguely close to the time Ambient was condemned, around 2350. The outside of the moon has 4 warehouses, and the entire perimeter is generally filled with old birds. Curiously, one of the warehouses seems to have hospital beds and an office with a desk. The rest of them are mostly barren, having nothing but the occasional old bird and empty storehouses. Aside from all that I've described, we really don't know very much about Artifice, as it's not even listed. The same can be said for Ambient, of which we have plenty more information. According to the info page on the terminal, Ambient was discovered a century ago, as of the documentation, and we can probably assume it was condemned immediately after its discovery. That means the information is probably from around the year 2450. The moon is completely desolate, and the surface is made of scorching amethyst. As previously mentioned, the horizon is in fact scattered with old birds. It's thought to have been used as a testing ground for them centuries before its discovery. There are even theories that a vast network of caves may support a geothermal ecosystem, but nothing can be known for certain. Many people who have played on Ambient are probably aware that it's not really a good moon to go to, at least in terms of loot. It's pretty dangerous, and it costs 150 just to get there. At this point, I believe the trend should be abundantly clear that there are a lot of secrets, a lot of things being done in secret, a lot of things that were only recently discovered despite clearly being ancient. I think we have enough clues at this point for me to weave together the theory that I'd like to share with everyone. I believe that the current state of Lethal Company's world was caused by a series of wars between many different groups of people, and the cause of these conflicts was an overwhelming desire to control resources. I think it's pretty obvious why any given party in this scenario would want so desperately to control as many resources as possible. I think the company monster had probably been a known issue for a while, and if everyone was still trying to supply the needs of their own nations while simultaneously contributing resources to feeding it to keep it at bay, eventually world leaders would realize it wasn't sustainable, at least not if everyone was still around. So why not go on a war campaign to take out as many of your competitors as possible and get as much control over resources as you can? It's clear that the resource conservation narrative is something that we're being led to believe. The poster in the ship calling for food preservation is a telltale sign of war, and although Sigurd and Jess both describe Titan as being a place where people lived in the past, now it simply appears to have been mined for its resources, which we get from the moon's description. To further support this theory, at the time that I'm writing this, there is a fourth unavailable new moon from version 50 named Liquidation, and the description reads, "Previously mined for its rich industrial resources, Liquidation is now largely an ocean moon." I believe that the reason why so many of these things are a secret is because everyone was keeping information from each other during these times of war. And I think that all of the documented information that we have access to now was probably provided by the boat as an organization, which would eventually come into company hands. As we know, many of the moons we visit in the game were only discovered recently relative to the overall scale of the timeline. These facilities were likely used either to collect natural resources, to manufacture weapons of war, or perhaps both. I think this explains why the facilities are often littered with turrets, landmines, and other hazards. It's because whoever built them really didn't want anyone getting out alive after their secret existence had been uncovered. The mansion versions of the facilities probably have significantly less lore importance in all honesty, but if I had to guess, it's probably just where some people might have lived in the past and are now abandoned, either due to extreme loss of life or just people deciding to migrate. This could explain their tendency to spawn the more supernatural-leaning enemies, but I will acknowledge that this is a reach. I honestly think that the mansions just aren't very important. Back to the topic of the moons though, I believe that based on the massive amount of context provided by the Old Bird Bestiary entry, that the Bumok Empire was responsible for the creation of the Old Birds, and conversely, the use of Artifice and Embryon in secret. I think the reason why they made them was because of the military tensions that they had with the Anglan Empire in the 2100s. In turn, this leads me to believe that the coil heads are a weapon made by the Anglan Empire, and I can prove it to you. If you pull the apparatus on Embryon, or on any moon with old birds for that matter, all of them will turn on early at the same time. For a long time, I was confused as to why the apparatus being pulled gives all players on the map a radiation notification. I mean, the radiation itself doesn't seem to actually mean anything, but then it hit me. The sound cannon, the 100,000 lumen headlight, and the ability to innately detect changes in radiation, every single one of these specifically noted features was manufactured intentionally as a perfect counter to the coil head, which is known to be radioactive, resets when presented with loud noise or bright lights, and is speculated to have been manufactured as a war weapon. The old birds are quite literally the walking antithesis to the coil head, which means they must have been made by opposing groups of people. And the only two groups of people we know to oppose each other are the Anglans and the Bumok. Though, in fairness, by the time we actually play as the people in Lethal Company, both empires are surely long gone. There are some obvious timeline discrepancies involving Sigurd and his crew, that need to be addressed. I honestly can't think of a reasonable explanation for this given our current information beyond pure speculation. It is clear that the given date of 1968 for the logs, it must be incorrect, as Sigurd was alive to give a danger rating and description of the old birds, and they weren't known by the wider world until at least 2143. The only reason why I can doubt this is because the date 1965 is referenced in the Bunker Spiders entry. The only way that I can think of that the given date of 1968 could be correct is if Sigurd was either a clone or somehow immortal, which, to be fair, there is some clearly abnormal memory loss present within the narrative of the logs, so it's not the most ridiculously far-fetched idea in the world, but honestly, I'm stumped. Speaking of stumped, I'm sure many of you have realized by now that I've avoided talking about the opening cutscene from version 50. To tell you the truth, this is mostly because I don't know what to make of it. It's very ambiguous, both in terms of when it could take place and which party's perspective it could be depicting. There's 4 main things to take away from the cutscene that I think should be kept in mind for the future though, and they're all very important. The first is that the cutscene transitions from the loading of the title screen, which shows the starting sequence of a computer from Halden Electronics, which is the organization that provides many of the manufactured goods that we can procure whilst playing the game. The copyright listed during the sequence for the computer, though, is 2084 through 2108. And if we take this date at a surface value and assume the technology isn't outdated, this attack takes place before old birds were known to have been first used in war. The second is that there is a coil head in the room opposite the player during the cutscene, which, if this takes place in 2108 like I said, could only mean that we're watching the perspective of a member of the Anglin Empire. Though I am perfectly willing to admit that a lot of my theory relies on their conflicts taking place in a vacuum, because if the coil heads were only recently discovered in the documentation we have access to, this would mean that the only way that whoever manufactured the old birds would be able to know that they're making a weapon to counter the coil heads is if they had some kind of spy or leak of information that didn't make it to the public. The third thing I think we should keep in mind from the cutscene is the calendar situated on the wall to the player's right. The calendar seems to depict the date as October 14th with a clear significance on the 23rd, which is possibly meant to signify some sort of deadline or other significant upcoming event. It is worth noting that the format of this calendar is really strange, as each line has 6 days instead of 7. One thing to note as well is that although Sigurd's logs are labeled with the year 1968, the month during the Titan log speaks of a war starting soon in early October. So if we did assume the year on the logs was just blatantly incorrect, which feels pretty likely at this point, this cutscene could be depicting the beginning of that war which was alluded to. If the people on Titan were expecting a war any day now, it would make sense if this were a weapons manufacturing facility explaining the presence of the coil head and the reason why it was attacked in the first place. Another potential reason as to why the calendar was present was simply to inform us that this cutscene does not depict the attack on the Anglin capital described in the Old Bird Bestiary entry, because we know for a fact that took place in December. However, based on what I said about the computer copyright date earlier, I had already discounted that idea. The fourth and final thing to note, of course, is probably the biggest mystery of Lethal Company version 50. Who or what is this shadow figure that appears behind your desk at the end of the cutscene? Personally, I have no idea. I don't know who this is, what it means, or why they're here. However, I do think that we'll certainly find out in the future. But for now, we'll just have to wait and see. As time goes on, I find myself being more and more enamored with the lore presented in Lethal Company, and I honestly think it's genuinely really interesting. Sigurd is a genius, and I'm sure he has so much more in store for us in the future. I had a blast making this video, and I'd love to hear about your guys' theories, because I definitely probably missed something along the way. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. It would make me pretty happy. Anyways, that's gonna be all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time.